This is Free to Exchange, the show where free-thinking scholars, free markets, and, ironically, free public television all meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. Immigration, both legal and illegal, is one of the most polarizing issues in American politics today. The debate surrounding immigration is even more heated here in Texas and other states along the Mexican border. And much is at stake in this debate for would-be immigrants, the world economy, and many believe the U.S. economy. The Free Market Institute at Texas Tech recently hosted a research conference on immigration to explore these contentious issues, and two of our conference participants are joining me on the show today. First, we'll hear from an immigration expert who believes immigration is good for the world and our own economy. Then on the second half of the show, I'll bring in another guest who is more skeptical of whether immigration will improve our society. Joining me now is Alex Nowrasteh. Alex earned his master's degree at the London School of Economics and is currently an immigration policy analyst at the Cato Institute's Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot for having me.
All right, so immigration is a very contentious issue, certainly in general public and in politics. And economists also don't all agree about immigration policy. They have diverse views, but it tends to be for different reasons than the general public. So economists who are anti-increased immigration, it's usually for reasons that are much different than the general public. I'd like to talk about some of these with you today. So in general, how do economists think that immigration impacts our economy?
Well, generally the consensus, or at least most economists think, is that immigrants are generally good for the U.S. economy, definitely good for the world economy. The question is just, well, how good are they and who are they best for?
Right. So for the world economy, it's enormous, isn't it?
Oh, it's gargantuan. I mean, if you think about it in terms of trade, the wage gains for a marginal immigrant coming to the United States are gigantic. You know, your average Mexican with a high school degree can expect a 253% increase in income just by moving across the border. For somebody from Vietnam, it's about 600%. For somebody from Haiti, it's about 1,000% increase.
Right. So why is it such a big increase?
So it's a big increase primarily because of free markets, of capitalism in the United States. We're more productive here. These workers, once they come here, they are, you know, in the case of the Mexican, 2.5 times more productive. In the case of the Haitian, 10 times more productive than they were in their home countries. And those big differences in wages have been sustained in part because these workers are not allowed to move here lawfully. Very few of them are actually able to come.
Right. Basically, their home countries have kind of lousy institutions and not as much capital and technology as we do. They come here, they get our freedoms, or work in our free market, and they make better use of themselves.
Absolutely, and not to mention, you know, the most important thing is security. You know, in this country, we don't have roving bands of gangsters except the government that come do it. But when they do, you know, hurt Americans, it's in a fairly predictable way, ex ante. In places like Mexico, you have a drug war going on. So it creates a lot of uncertainty for economic growth.
So I think a lot of Americans would agree, of course it's good for the immigrants to come here, and for that matter, it does a heck of a lot better than development aid or any other thing that we try to do to help these countries. But they'd say, but it's at the expense of us. This is kind of the Lou Dobbs view. They're going to turn us into a third world economy. Why does it make us wealthier too?
Well, you know, that Lou Dobbs view is a weird sort of fixed pie view of the economy. The notion that, you know, the resources are fixed and these people come in here, they're not going to take anything. But the primary reason why is it increases the amount of production being able to be done here because we have better institutions. More workers means more production. And quite frankly, the immigrants are very different from most Americans. They're not substitutes for American workers. So even if an immigrant has a high school degree, his language skills, his experience are different from that of an American who has a high school degree. So there's just not a lot of direct competition.
What you're telling me sounds an awful lot like when economists just talk about free trade in goods and services. We get a good that's made in Mexico or China because their skills are different than ours and they produce it at a lower cost, and it comes here and we're wealthier as a result. They're wealthier, but I can't outsource my lawn care to China.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much the free trade equivalent of all the service sectors and all the non-tradable sectors. I mean, if we were talking about in Mexico, then make a house that can be exported to the United States for 10% cheaper than we make houses here, well, that's no different than having the Mexicans come here themselves and build the house at 10% cheaper. I mean, the economic effects are very similar in that regard.
So I think, so how big, let's quantify this, for how big are the gains to the Americans from migrants coming here?
They're pretty large. So, I mean, George Borjas has done some work about this. He says the gains are in the neighborhood of like $50 billion a year in terms of that. But of course, that does not count the gains to the new Americans.
Right, to the immigrants themselves, those gains can be, you know, doubling of world GDP.
Yeah.
But to the immigrants coming, to the native born, 50 million's
50 billion,
I'd
yeah.
like 50 million.
Yeah.
But in proportion to a $14 trillion economy, it's been relatively modest.
And that's a fairly negative estimate. That's a very conservative estimate of the gains. I mean, in the long run, the gains from extra innovation, especially in the high-tech sector that immigrants come here and bring, the gains, immigrants are on average twice as entrepreneurial as Americans are. So you basically seed a lot of creativity and innovation that in the long run can have huge potential payoffs.
Yeah, so still, even the bigger estimates, it's kind of modest as a percent of our economy, but that's because of their existing immigration policy that leaves many illegal and excludes many too, so it could get bigger. But I bet you the viewers out there, somebody's jumping in their seat right now with the #1 objection that I hear to immigration in the general public. In fact, I doubt there's very much viewer overlap between South Park on Comedy Central and PBS, but it's even made South Park, they'll steal our jobs.
Yeah.
What's the merits of this objection?
There really aren't any merits to that. I mean, for the first thing, immigrants come here when there are jobs available, and they leave when there aren't jobs available. We saw that at the beginning of the Great Recession when the housing market collapsed. Second of all, once they come here, they are not just workers who are working in the factories or in the fields. They are also buying the things that are made by themselves and other Americans while they're here, so they boost demand. And then thirdly, because they have different skills, because they have different language abilities, because they move to different parts of the country, they're just not competing with very many Americans to begin with. I mean, if you're one of your viewers who's upset, let's say is an accountant, he has a college degree, a low-skilled, less than high school degree immigrant is just not going to compete with him with his jobs. I mean, in the same way that I'm not competing with any astrophysicists. If you multiplied me by 1 million, it would not affect the wages of astrophysicists one bit because we're just not substitutable.
Yeah, I think there's a perception problem. I mean, we could take one of these TV cameras and we could go out in Lubbock, no problem, and find someone, put a camera on them and say, they'll tell you, I used to have a job in X industry, immigrants came in and took my job. Yeah. But what we don't see is these other jobs that are created. Sure. Because they're statistical. We can't put a camera on that one because jobs are created for all sorts of reasons. But some of what you've been saying kind of rolls into the next common objection. It might be they don't steal our jobs, but they got to push down our wages. Heck, even if we just understand basic economics, you know, the supply and the demand, if we shift that curve, man, wages have to go down. But when economists study this, they don't find that very much, do they?
They don't. I mean, George Borjas probably finds the most negative finding, which is that the wages of less than high school graduate Americans are pushed down by about 4.5% since 1990, and that those with more than a college degree are pushed down by about 1.5%. But the 75% of Americans in the middle basically have seen wage increases as a result. So his big finding is the impact of wages in the U.S. over time is about 0. I mean, it's really the housing market that is affected more than any other market in the United States by immigration because they all got to find a place to live, they all got to rent somewhere, and the supply of land isn't increasing that much.
So it boosts the
prices,
the assets of people who own these things.
And guess who they are? They're mostly Americans.
You know, it's interesting as you point out of where the wage effects are. It's the very top end of our skill set and the very bottom end. Because if you think about the immigrants who come in, I mean, look around a college campus, right?
Yeah. How
many of the PhDs are foreign born relative to what you see in the normal population? And
Quite,
ditto,
yeah.
of course, of high school dropouts, right?
Quite a lot. I mean, you see about 1/3 of all immigrants have less than a high school degree compared to about 9% of American adults. And immigrants are also overrepresented on the top end of the spectrum. But Professor Ethan Lewis from Dartmouth has found that even when an immigrant has the same education level as an American, because the difference is the obvious one being language, it sort of causes this specialization even within this field of education. So the best example is a restaurant. I mean, a low-skilled immigrant who doesn't speak English very much, who comes and works in a restaurant, is going to work as a busboy or as a janitor or as a line cook, jobs that don't require communication. But what that's going to do is going to push Americans with the same amount of education into jobs that require communication, so which are higher paying jobs, you know, waiter, waitress, manager. So we see that sort of specialization occur within educational groups, so that sort of makes up for a lot of the reason why wages don't fall for Americans.
So the next one I'd hear usually that has something to do with economics, but now we're getting a little bit out of the straight economics and into the transition to public policy, is, well, that may all be well and good, but you know, they don't pay enough in taxes, they consume welfare, they use the local emergency room, they breed children who go to school, so they're a fiscal drag. So they take more away in our tax revenue than they contribute.
That's a very common argument, and it's one as a libertarian that I decided to look into because it could be a serious objection. What you find, though, is that the data does not support that. I mean, people usually count the costs, like going to school, but they don't count the long-term gains of that person once they're done with school working for 50 years and paying taxes over that long period of time. So when people do long-run studies, dynamic studies, they assume the economy changes over time and the taxes they pay change over time. What you see is that immigration really doesn't cause deficits at all, nor does it increase them or decrease them. So basically the impact on budgets is about nil. I mean, immigrants are taxpayers, they are tax consumers, but if you take a look over the long run, they basically cover themselves.
So it's the equivalent of, me having another kid or something. Of course, he's a horrible tax burden for 18, 22, God knows, hopefully not much longer than that. But then we have to, in order to judge whether he's a net fiscal drag, look at his lifetime earnings and then his retirement time. And immigrants tend to be already out of school age and younger, so they're not. So actually, does it help prop up Social Security?
So when it comes to the entitlements, it helps prop it up for two reasons. One, immigrants are a little bit younger, and they're much like, three reasons. You're younger, they're more likely to be illegal, so they're paying into the system and can't take out benefits, and a lot of them return home to retire. And you can't get a lot of the Medicare benefits from overseas. So according to some studies done by the Journal of Health Affairs, immigrants pay on average $14 billion a year more in a Medicare Part A than they take out, compared to natives consuming $31 billion more than they put in.
Now, I remember reading somewhere something that you wrote that said, well, maybe if some of this wasn't true, maybe if they're a particular fiscal drag, I think your paper, I don't remember what the title was, but it was something like, let's build a wall around the welfare state instead of a wall around the country. What's real quick, we only have about a minute before we go to break, what's your main argument there?
It's a lot easier to reform welfare in order to block access to non-citizens than it is to stop all immigration into the United States. We spend tens of billions of dollars on immigration enforcement over the last few decades with basically no effect. The only reason why people stopped coming is because of the recession. However, we have severely restricted means-tested welfare in the recent past in the United States, especially to immigrants. Most of those restrictions have held. We can make them stricter, but that is definitely capable. We're definitely capable of doing that.
All right. Well, Alex, thank you for sharing. Next up, we're going to bring in another guest to join the discussion.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Welcome back. Still with me is Alex Nowrasteh of the Cato Institute. And joining us now is my friend and colleague, Dr. Stephen Balch. Dr. Balch directs the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization here at Texas Tech. He's co-author of the recent The Vanishing West, 1964 to 2010. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get started on our issue, since you run an institute here at Tech 2 that collaborates with us more than occasionally, would you tell us just a little bit about briefly what your institute does?
Well, there's precious little study of Western civilization as a phenomenon in our universities. And I can't think of a more important thing, short of the free market, that we could study.
That's why we have them on.
Free market is part of Western civilization, of course. Western civilization has transformed the world. It has remade the human condition. And it has done it on the basis of developing certain principles of thought and action, certainly reason, solving problems through the use of reason, having a deliberative politics based on reason, and in addition to that, on freedom, on people being able to choose their ideas, choose their way of life, move around freely. These things have developed slowly and painfully, but I think from the very beginning, from the Western origins in the ancient world, the seeds were there. So we're trying to bring back into academic focus the big picture questions about the nature of Western civilization, about its worldwide consequence, about its origins, and about its future, where it's going.
Which is why we have you with us here today. So one of the things you said is people moving around freely. People moving around freely might be part of immigration, but do you have concerns about the foundation of the West's interaction with immigration?
In general, I think people moving around freely is a very good thing. And to worry about it requires having specific reason to do so, specific and compelling reason to do so. I think immigration throughout the history of the United States has been a great boon to the country, and I think it can continue to be. But here are my concerns.
Yeah, and by the way, I'd like to say, I got a feeling where we're going, and this is where I think the debate gets interesting and can be different on this show than what we hear in the general public and some of the talking heads, because the economists who have reservations about immigration, these type of things are probably going to resonate with, whereas what I had Alex on discussing, economists here, they steal our jobs and we're like, oh great, here we go again. But these are the more profound ones I think that we should be discussing.
Well, we shall see. But in any event.
At the end I'll be like, no.
Okay. You know, I have recently, when I kind of talk about this subject, it seems to me that the Western world has been able to blossom and flourish in the way it has, because much about it is anomalous. The key thing that's anomalous is, in fact, the scope we give to freedom of all sorts. We give that scope by having curbed the power of the state. If you look through most of history, the principal way of getting rich in most times and places was to extract wealth from others. And the richest people in most times and places in the past were kings and aristocrats and high priests and whatever, folks who sat on top of rents.
The big extractors.
The great extractors. You know, there's a lively competition in those days, usually violent, to extract. What happened was we managed to tame that, and we tamed that through setting up a set of institutions and a set of principles that people imbibed, that took to heart, took seriously. That were designed to keep coercion under bounds and allow maximum room for freedom. They consisted of things like rule of law, representative government, notions of individual rights and property rights especially. You can find elements of these institutions and principles outside of the West, but only in the West did they really have the full development whose product we now enjoy.
Of course, they've been exported to other parts of the world now, too.
They've been exported with varying degrees of success and hopefully with more success as time goes on. The thing that worries me is that being anomalies in the human state of affairs and resting on a variety of values and habits, one has to keep them nourished, one has to keep them refreshed. And quite apart from immigration, I don't think right now we're doing a very good job of that in this country. And I don't think our public policy is heading by and large in a very good direction. I think that's largely because of the education a lot of people have received. We have one class of immigrants that you didn't mention and you didn't mention, and those are the people who migrate into our country out of their mother's wombs. That's really a class of immigrants that first and foremost we need to attend to. We all are part of that. I was part of it quite a long time ago in a rather different educational milieu that now exists. But, you know, if you come into education at all levels these days, you will find that what used to be the narrative, you know, the great Whig history of growing freedom, has been replaced by a very different narrative that looks at America and Western society in general as a kind of inherited series of iniquities that we have to fight against.
So where you're going with this is that America's not preserving its ideals of liberty and principles it was founded on.
Even among us Native Americans, we're not doing a very good job.
And you're worried that immigrants are going to come in.
Bring into the country a lot of people whose values often are more foreign than those who are born here complicates the matter in a whole variety of ways. And I think that's at the very least a caution. There are other reasons to be cautious too. I mean, the general experience with communal societies in which people don't develop a common set of identification. We don't work to do that anymore either. We now encourage things like multiculturalism and ethnic identity. That kind of experience is not very heartening. So one can talk about how many people we should have in and what they should be and et cetera, but I think perhaps prior to that discussion, we need to talk about how we can get back on track with respect to the socialization and education of Americans so that they are prepared to receive and then impart to others as they come, the kind of values that hold our country together.
So we're going to break away from the two guys in linen suits talking model for a moment and bring Alex back in here. Alex, do you have concerns related to that, or how do you cope with that type of thing? This is the type of thing a free market person should be concerned with, right?
I think so, and I think what the saving grace is, it's terrible what people are learning today in schools and public schools, but the saving grace is that nobody's actually learning anything. So, I mean, I went to public school in Southern California, and they taught me, or they tried to teach me a lot of this nonsense that the good professor here is talking about, but nobody's really paying a lot of attention. But when you take a look at the rates of assimilation today, let's say of Hispanic immigrants in the United States, the rates of taking up English language, for instance, of accepting that English is the language that you need to get ahead in the United States, the rates of learning, of going to college, which might be a problem in this situation, but the rates of economic advancement of these ways, of patriotic assimilation, of saying that America is the best country in the world, when standardizing for education and age, Hispanics born here are more patriotic than other Americans. So these are the same worries we had about 100 years ago about patriotic assimilation during the Americanization movement with Italians and Eastern Europeans and Jewish immigrants and other immigrants who were also different and thought to come from a lot of communalistic cultures and oftentimes did. But those concerns I don't think bore any fruit, and we don't see much evidence today that it's really shifting. So they're totally different. Assimilating like the old ones did, but the culture they're assimilating to is a different culture. We're not as individualistic orientated as we were in the 19th century. That would,
well, I guess I'd be yes, I think that's true. I less optimistic than that. Back in the day when those immigrants were coming in around the turn of the beginning of the late 19th, beginning of the 20th century, there were very strenuous efforts made, in the public schools particularly, to Americanize them. You had guys like Theodore Roosevelt traveling across the face of the land and talking about how we shouldn't have hyphenated Americans. Now we glory in hyphenated Americans. If one talks about actual behavior, you're sort of suggesting that the kind of education we now have rolls off like water on a duck's back. I'm not quite so sure, for two reasons. First of all, because the ways of freedom are not natural, I think, as much as we would like to human beings. Remember that old Oscar Hammerstein song? You have to be carefully taught. And simply not teaching them it creates real dangers. But secondly, I mean, take a look at what's, we run, by the way, a nonpartisan institute, but take a look at what's recently been going on with respect to a principle as basic as the rule of law, where the Affordable Care Act has been multiple times and in important ways amended by diktat, by presidential diktat. I remember once hearing quite some time ago Robert Bork, late Robert Bork, say, you've reached an important moment in history when a great principle is evoked without effect. Well, I don't even hear people evoking the principle of the rule of law, particularly nowadays.
Americans and immigrants, though, right?
And if one of the things you want to do with immigrants is to socialize them, then the Americans have to have their act together, too, and I just don't see that. I think we have real problems with it in any of it.
I think part of the disagreement here is sort of this rosy view of the past, of assimilation working really well, or American culture being more welcoming in the past, or more pushing people toward the values that we like, that we both share and that we like. But you take a look at the Americanization movement back in the early 20th century, and the biggest achievement was getting American school kids to salute the flag, similar in the way that Nazis did, as well as putting, and not to equate it in every other way like that, as well as putting American, as well as putting American flags in every classroom. If you take a look at the actual number of people who were taught English by that program is very small. The number of people affected, very small, and the number of people who were actually alienated by that. Polish immigrants, for instance, who fled Europe because they didn't like Prussianism. This forced militarization, this forced assimilation, were turned off dramatically by that. So there's a lot of evidence that the Americanization movement actually slowed down the rate of assimilation for the people who were most affected and most impacted by it.
So we've just got 1 minute left, so I want to come back to Steve for a last thought on this. If the concern really is that they're going to undermine our culture that gives us our freedoms, including our free markets that we both care about, what would be a way to deal with that of them coming in? Would you suggest longer paths to citizenship? You and I write their free market citizenship test, or what ideas would you have?
Well, I think first and foremost we have to change the elite culture, and how that is done is hard to say, but we need to do that. I think we have to take socialization seriously. I don't think it happens. It happens naturally. With respect to immigration, I think we should view to a significant degree the question of how many and who come through people with our perspective through the lens of these larger difficulties. I think we have to take that into account rather than kind of complicating the situation more than it already is. You know, if people come in and vote for the more status party, I don't think we're really in a better position than we were before, and I'd worry about that.
Okay, and Alex is bouncing in his seat here. Go ahead.
I don't think the government can plan the healthcare market very well, nor can I think they can pave the roads well. I don't know how they're going to be able to plan the culture well going forward with selective immigration.
All right. Well, thank you both very much for joining me today. It's been a great discussion. I
Pleasure.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
There's an old quip that if you line up all of the economists in the world end to end, you won't reach a conclusion. Well, that's not true when economists study immigration. Economists who study immigration largely find that there's large benefits to the world economy, that they make the native-born population of the receiving country a little bit wealthier, that there's no effect on the number of jobs, and that wages aren't really hurt, and at best, maybe it's some high school dropouts that are hurt by this. That doesn't mean, though, that all economists agree that we should have radical open borders or even increase immigrant flows to the United States. Their objections are largely centered around issues of culture or political institutions that our second guest was raising. And really, the gains we get from immigration, while important, if they undermine our institutions of private property, economic freedom, rule of law that are responsible for our long-run growth, that could be very damaging. I'm pretty suspicious that they actually do damage that. After all, they're fleeing many countries that have horrible institutions now. It seems odd that they'd want to replicate those here in the United States. Certainly the 19th century immigrants didn't do that. But I think it is a legitimate issue that we should be debating instead of these things that economists know not to be true but unfortunately dominate most of the rest of the media. Thanks for watching today.